Great. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm David Sanger. I'm national security correspondent for the New York Times, and I'm extremely delighted to be joined this morning with Azeem Azhar, who known to many of you for his writings on technology, Exponential View, which is both a podcast and a newsletter. He has past lives in equity research and strategy and venture capital. And Azim, thanks for joining us at the Athens Democracy Forum. Let me
My
start
pleasure.
off with this question. Both in the United States and in Europe, we have developed this remarkable love hate relationship with the big technology companies. We can't live without them. We can't get on our phones and our computers without turning to Google and to Facebook and to others. And yet, both countries in various ways, or both continents in various ways, are now struggling with this. Here in the United States, there's questions about whether Facebook and Google are doing enough to suppress hate speech, to
Hmm.
deal with candidates for president who may be trying to suppress the vote. In Europe, there's been years long questions about privacy. There were questions about antitrust, and now the Trump administration is about to go after Google on antitrust grounds itself, proving that we're becoming more and more European all the time. My first question to you is really the broadest one. How do we begin to think about this? Whether these are entities that can be regulated, should be regulated, and what should that look like?
Well, first of all, David, thank you very much. And it's wonderful to speak with you. I've been a fan of your reporting for many, many years. So it's a real honor to interlocute with you in this way. Uh, I think we have found ourselves at quite a strange spot. A decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, not many of us thought that technology companies were really as important as they are turning out to be today. And what has happened over that 10 or 15-year period has been that aspects of the world that were physical have now become digital. And as they've become digital, we have to access them through the platforms of these technology companies. And it's not just the big few that we think of every day: Google, Alphabet, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, of course, Microsoft. It's also players who have more narrow functions like Stripe in payments or Cloudflare, which protects many of the digital networks that serve these services up. And there are a few interesting dimensions to what's happened as they've become bigger and bigger. And they've started to fulfill part of the role of the public infrastructure, the infrastructure that you or I might have remembered growing up with in the physical analog world is now mediated through these technology companies. And that gives them a great deal of power, but it's not a power around which there has been that much democratic accountability. There is no clear chain of accountability. There's no check or balance on how that power gets exerted. And so, one of the consequences of all of this, I think, is that we've got these somewhat inadequate but sometimes effective ways of checking what these companies are doing. I mean, strangely, sort of employee walkouts, which we're starting to see in some of these firms, can adjust these company policies in ways that other forms of action may not help. And I think that comes to the nub of our discussion, which is what is the kind of accountability we expect on these companies, given that they now operate what we might consider to be parts of the public space, but yet they don't have that traditional democratic accountability.
Well, you raise a really interesting point, Azim, and give you two public utility examples that I'd be interested in your commenting on. So, just 2 nights ago, sitting up here, I was teaching a national security class that I teach at a university, and In the midst of it, we all got notified that Microsoft's systems for Azure, their cloud systems, had
Mm,
gone down, as had Office 365. And of course, you're
right.
trying to teach all on Zoom these days, and your screen is filled with your password no longer works. And we had some functionality of the Zoom functionality, but not everything else. And of course, as soon as I'm done with the class, I'm thinking, okay, well, the Russians have finally gotten back at Microsoft for their report last week describing their hacking operations during the election. And of course, it wasn't it. Microsoft had rolled out new code for Azure that morning, tried to roll it back when everything collapsed. It didn't work, and we went through a few hours before they could get back up. You would have only seen this before in sort of public utilities doing blackouts.
Right.
So that helped us understand our dependence. On the employee walkout side, the one time Google's had a real big employee walkout in recent times, other than on sexual harassment issues, it was for their contributions to a United States government Defense Department program to help improve the targeting accuracy of drones
Hmm.
using artificial intelligence techniques. And of course, famously, Google dropped out of this. Well, this was not the kind of public regulation through employee walkout that the Defense Department had in mind.
Right. I mean, I agree, and I think that the two examples that you bring up draw attention to how inadequate and inconsistent the relying on the mechanisms that we currently have today are. I will bring up a couple of examples on this subject as well. There, in the last 24 hours, the CEO of a company building blockchain financial infrastructure issued a Medium post where he said, we're going to focus on our mission, and we want the politics that is not related to our business left outside the door. Come into work to work. And it's a really interesting challenge that has created a whole set of discussions around, is this an appropriate way for an infrastructure company to run its operations? But of course, the point that I draw out
What
there
kind of
is that
politics was he trying to cut out from this, Azim? Was it
uh,
electoral politics, domestic,
yes, it's
anything that
electoral
didn't have to do
politics.
with it? Mm-hmm.
It's electoral
Mm-hmm.
politics, right? And I think there was a moment where electoral politics was perhaps not as polarized as it is in the US right now, that you could find many more grounds for common agreement. But I think at the moment where we sit, certainly, and it's been true in the UK where I am, it's very hard to distinguish the partisan politics from kind of fundamental questions about sovereignty and citizen rights and the rest. And that's certainly the case in the US, where the partisan politics has teetered around questions of civil rights, and in the UK, where we dealt with the change in the nature of our rights as we left the European Union. But there's a second example which you write about very well in your book, The Perfect Weapon, which is around Microsoft's leadership in coming together to argue for a digital Geneva Convention, which is this agreement that technology companies wouldn't use their technologies as weapons of war in particular circumstances. And I think Microsoft has behaved very, very well as a technology company in doing that. But the problem with the Microsoft approach is similar to this approach of Coinbase, is that it's dependent on the goodwill and the good nature and the scholarship and the values of the senior execs in that company, and nowhere else. And so essentially, the good behavior, if we believe that Microsoft or Coinbase has behaved well in this case, is really by individual fiat. And that's not really the kind of political system that we would want to have. I mean, we spent hundreds of years moving away from the impact of individual fiat from individual powerful men. And so I think we have the question that's really interesting for me is, how do we move from these little signals, some of which we might agree with and some of which we might not agree with, to some kind of governance mechanism that creates the accountability that allows us to live with these big technology companies.
Well, Zim, the example you use of the Digital Geneva Convention, I think is particularly fascinating because it's a way for companies to push governments, whereas so much of this debate is often about how governments would push companies. So if you dig in for just a moment to the Digital Geneva Convention, the idea here is to come up with some kind of code of conduct about how we use cyber weapons, vulnerabilities, and so forth, and how we do not. In other words, would we decide that election systems are off limits for states to mess around with each other? I think many in the United States might sign up to that today.
Mm.
Would you agree that cutting off the electric grid during peacetime would be something you would not do because it would so affect civilians? And that's where the Geneva Convention concept came in. Of course, the Geneva Conventions, as I need to remind you, was all about protecting civilians from who were defenseless from acts of war. But what's also interesting about the Geneva Conventions, the real ones, the previous ones, is that they were not initially formulated by governments. It was the Red Cross that
Mm.
put the Geneva Conventions together. And it sort of dragged governments into signing on to them. And today, of course, we expect governments to adhere to the Geneva Convention. They don't always. Bashar Assad wakes up every morning thinking about how he could violate the Geneva Conventions today.
Right.
But we are living in the hope that one day he will come to some form of accountability and say the International Court at The Hague or something similar. In what's going on with the digital Geneva Conventions, as you point out, it's the companies pushing the governments.
Mm.
And there's an argument to be made that if the companies themselves come together and put together this common grouping, the governments may be forced along. President Macron issued something similar in the past year and a half at the 100th anniversary of the end of World War One. And the two major democracies that didn't sign on to sort of this sort of digital sort of basic behavior were the United States and India.
Right.
Pretty
Right.
interesting. Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether you think that by having these mini-lateral agreements between uh, forward-looking companies, we can create enough of a head of steam to start to bring policymakers to the table, and perhaps get a few countries, nations to sign up, and that creates the momentum to create the framework. Right? Is that a viable path to getting to a sort of a global compact on these types of questions?
Well, it's viable, but it's tricky. And what makes it tricky is that any agreement that didn't start with the United States and China, the two countries that run the most global infrastructure, isn't going to be worth a whole lot. And if you don't include Russia, which has been the major disruptor, even though we don't think of them as a significant tech force, you've also got a problem. But we can't get off of the first ground level with the Chinese and others. And part of this has to do with what you believe the internet's all about. And so, Azeem, you and I have grown up in a world in which the internet is supposed to be about connecting around the world and enhancing freedom. The
Hmm.
first thing the Chinese and the Russians have said is if we're going to stop malicious activity on the internet, let's begin by having perfect identity. When Azeem logs on, let's be sure that we know for sure it's Azeem. And when David logs
Right.
on, let's make sure we know it's David. Well, of course, the first thing that allows them to do is find and stomp out dissent and jail whoever it is who's there under their own identity and suggesting that Vladimir Putin may not be
Mm.
running the country or Xi Jinping with the full democratic liberties of their constituents in mind. So that
Yeah.
gets pretty complicated. George, we're going to get a couple of questions from the audience. Let me throw one of them to you because it fits right in with this theme. These
Mm.
are from students at the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. Um, in the last years, we've seen how social media has contributed to the spread of false information and helped spread polarizing ideologies. This gets right to the Russia China problem. To what
Right.
extent are these problems caused by social media's inner structure and business model? The business model meaning, of course, in this case, that the more eyeballs, the better, and we're not going to look at the content, or at least that was the old business model.
Yeah, and it's pretty much the same as a new business model. I mean, it's a great question, and the reality is that content on a social media platform is only useful insofar as it gets many people to look at it, and against which adverts can be run. And there is uh, a vicious cycle of using improved algorithms to show me more material that I will find interesting, in order to get me to stay on that site and spend more time. And YouTube was the sort of initial master of all of this. Now, the problem with all of that is really to do with our own reptilian brains, which is that it's a sense of shock and disgust and extreme emotion that gets us to continue to pay attention. It's why adrenaline fills our cinemas. And so you end up in this, and this strange situation where the content that works the most is often the content that is most prurient and most divisive. And by work, I mean what gets people to stay on site. Now, I think that in a sense, Facebook has recognized that that has been an issue historically. And a couple of years ago, they changed the way in which they started to rank their content, and they attenuated some of this. And YouTube has tried to do similar types of things. But despite those changes over the last couple of years, what we've seen is the rapid growth of conspiracy theories on both of these platforms and in other places. So there is some problem with the business model, in a sense that it connects to the worst demons of our nature rather than the better angels of our nature. But I think there's something else that happens within this business model, and it's not just about extremism. It is also about a function which is a word in English called homophily, which comes from, of course, two Greek words meaning the connection, the friendship of the same. Birds of a feather flock together. And many technologies historically, for over a longer period of time, have made it easier for us to mix with people who are more like ourselves. And that function is also something that is starting to emerge across social networks, which means that of course, you get this lack of diversity in the material that you tend to see. And I think that is problematic. It doesn't necessarily have to be like that. I mean, I think that what one can also see that you can run algorithms that push content towards the median. And that's often the argument about some of the Chinese social media platforms, which is that they are designed in such a way to bring the extreme edges closer to the middle, because that's what is in the interests of that state. So I don't think it's
But
an easy question to tackle.
no, it's not. And it takes us to the next one that's on, which goes right to this, which says how much of this problem can be attributed to a lack of enforcement of community rules? Is there a difference between platforms? Well, I would start off by saying, just based on your last answer, the problem isn't just the difference among platforms. The problem is the difference among communities, right?
Right.
I mean, in the United States, um, you know, if I believe in a conspiracy theory, Azeem, you may decide you don't really want to listen to me. You certainly might decide you don't want to invite me to dinner, but it's my constitutional right to spout a ridiculous conspiracy theory. Now, we've begun to see the platforms say, but that doesn't necessarily mean it fits within the community rules of the platform. The problem that platforms are running into is every community has different rules. We had a wonderful story in the Times the other day, wonderful, wonderful and scary, about a Thai resort that called the police when they didn't like the review that was put on TripAdvisor by somebody who was protesting the corkage fees at the resort. The police showed up. It was an American who was visiting. And because this visitor had complained about the corkage fees on TripAdvisor, I'm sure I've complained about lesser things on TripAdvisor, he was arrested and might be subject to up to 2 years for defamation. Imagine if you did this to every restaurant reviewer at the New York Times, right? You know, how
Right.
many restaurants have been unhappy with their reviews in the New York Times? So when we hear a question like this about attributed to a lack of enforcement of community rules, the question is, what do you do when the platform's rules would differ dramatically from the communities?
Uh, and that I think is a really big problem for these global platforms. They've already had to dance around it. So of course, within Germany, neo-Nazi content is banned, and that's been sort of upheld constitutionally. And so eBay for 20 years and other companies have had to be very careful and take particular steps to contend with that. And this, I think, comes back to, in a sense, the internet's original design breakthrough, which is also one of its original sins, which is this notion that it was cast as an end-to-end, globally coherent network that somehow resided in the ether above national sovereignty or territorial sovereignty. And as it's become more and more powerful and more important, those questions of national sovereignty and territorial sovereignty are rising to clash with a simplistic notion. And just this
Right.
morning, I should say this last thought, just this morning, I mean, a bunch of Indian entrepreneurs get together to canvass the government to say, we need a national Indian app store that's independent of Google and Apple.
That's really wild. So what we're seeing is that geopolitics is clawing its way back
Yeah.
and seeking basically to reimpose the national lines of sovereignty that the internet was out to destroy. Well, I can't say that we solved any of this, but I can tell you one thing for sure, Azeem, we have run out of time. So it's been wonderful chatting with you. Thanks much. I encourage everybody to go sign up for Exponential View and listen to the podcast because you'll get more discussion of this. And I can guarantee you that if we manage to meet back at the Athens Democracy Forum, hopefully in person a year from now, vaccines and other such things willing, that this problem will be nowhere near solved and probably significantly worse. Thanks a
Agree
lot,
with that.
Azeem.
Yeah.
Great to chat with you. Bye bye.
David, my pleasure. Thank you.